It's strange how things start. You never really plan on losing control. It's more like this slow drift, a quiet slide into something you never thought would touch your life. I remember the first time I reached for a quick escape, and it wasn't even dramatic. It was just a way to ease that gnawing discomfort I couldn't name. At the time, it felt harmless, a momentary relief, a sigh in the middle of a heavy silence I didn't want to hear. But I didn't realize then that the silence was me. I used to think addiction was for other people, those with real problems. I was holding things together, at least on the outside, but inside it felt like pieces of me were missing. Not broken exactly, just absent, like I was living around a hollow space I didn't know how to fill. And when I found something that gave me even a glimpse of peace, whether it was a drink, a screen, someone's validation, I clung to it, because in that moment I felt closer to being whole. No one tells you that the things you use to survive can become the things that slowly undo you. I didn't see it as addiction, not at first. It felt more like a habit, maybe a bad one, but manageable. That's the trap, the illusion of control. You tell yourself you can stop whenever you want, that you're just tired or stressed or going through a rough patch. But underneath that rational voice, there's another part of you whispering, please just make it stop. Make me stop. And yet you keep reaching, not because you're weak, but because somewhere deep inside, you're looking for something real, something safe, something like home. I think that's what addiction really is, in its rawest form, a search for home in all the wrong places, a yearning to feel held, understood, seen. But when the world around you doesn't offer that, and when your own reflection feels like a stranger, you start chasing moments that imitate the feeling. Temporary comfort, temporary calm, even if it burns on the way down. The hard part is, on the surface, it often looks like pleasure, like indulgence. But the truth is, addiction doesn't bloom in joy. It grows in pain. It thrives in the places we've been taught to hide. And for so long, I didn't know how to be honest about that. I didn't even know how to be honest with myself. There were days when I'd stare at the ceiling, my body still, my mind racing, and ask myself, why do I feel so empty? I had people who cared, goals that looked good on paper, even moments of laughter, but it was like none of it could penetrate the numbness that had settled inside me. That's the thing no one tells you. Numbness isn't the absence of pain. It's its echo stretched out so far it starts to feel like nothing. And so we reach for the phone, the bottle, the pill, the project, the person, whatever offers the illusion of stillness, even if it costs us a piece of ourselves. Because in those moments, even destruction feels better than silence. Looking back, I see it now. I wasn't trying to destroy myself. I was trying to find myself, trying to gather up the scattered pieces of a self I'd never really been taught to love, or even know. That's where the shame used to sneak in. The voice that said, you should be better than this, stronger, more disciplined, less needy. But now I see that voice for what it is, the echo of a world that confuses strength with suppression, a world that shames vulnerability, dismisses inner hunger, and tells us that needing connection makes us weak. It doesn't. In fact, it's the deepest kind of strength to admit, I'm not okay. I don't want to live like this anymore. I used to think healing was about fixing something broken, but now I know. Healing is about remembering what was never broken in the first place. It's about seeing that the part of you that reaches for relief isn't bad. It's just hurt. It's just tired. It's just trying. And maybe, just maybe, that part of you deserves a little more grace, a little more kindness, a little more space to breathe without needing to earn it. That's where my story really begins. Not in the fall, but in the moment I stopped running from my own ache. When I sat down inside the silence I used to flee and whispered, I'm listening. That's when things started to shift, not all at once, not dramatically, but gently, quietly, like the sound of your own voice echoing back after being lost for too long. That's where I'll pick up next, because what I found when I listened was everything I thought I'd lost. There's something quietly terrifying about realizing your worst habits aren't random. They're rooted in pain you've never fully faced. For the longest time, I didn't understand why I kept doing things that hurt me. I wasn't reckless, I wasn't out of control in a way you'd see in a movie. But there was this subtle sabotage, this constant undercurrent of choices that chipped away at my self-respect. And the more I questioned it, the more I bumped into something deeper, the feeling that I wasn't enough, that I had to fill in some invisible gap to be okay. No one wakes up and says, "I think I'll destroy my life today." What really happens is more subtle. You grow up learning what love isn't, and then spend your adulthood chasing shadows of connection, hoping they'll give you the thing you never had words for. For me, addiction wasn't about the substance or the behavior. It was about what I was running from. Or more accurately, what I was aching for. There was always this deep, aching loneliness in me. Not the kind that's solved by being around people. I had friends. I wasn't isolated in the traditional sense. But even in a room full of people, I often felt alone. It was like I was surrounded by life, but somehow untouched by it. And the moments I turned to my addictions, whatever they were at the time, I was really just trying to touch something, to feel real, to feel safe, to feel like I existed in a way that mattered. And when I heard Gabor Maté talk about how addiction is less about the substance and more about the pain, something clicked. He said that every addiction starts with a wound, and I thought, yes, that's exactly it. My behavior wasn't about pleasure, it was about relief. Relief from shame, from emptiness, from the unbearable sense that something was missing and I didn't know how to get it back. Carl Jung talked about the shadow, those parts of us we exile because we're afraid they'll make us unlovable. That's what addiction did for me. It numbed the parts I couldn't face. But the price of that numbness was disconnection. From others, yes, but more tragically, from myself. And it's wild how the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. I started noticing how I'd clench my jaw when I was around certain people, or how my chest would tighten when I'd feel like I'd disappointed someone. These weren't just random reactions. They were echoes of old pain. Pain I hadn't named. Pain that sat underneath the surface of my normal life, driving me to soothe myself in whatever way I could. What shocked me the most was how many of those wounds weren't from adulthood, but from childhood. It wasn't just about one dramatic event. It was the accumulation of little moments where I didn't feel safe or seen or good enough. Moments when I learned that certain emotions made me too much, that asking for attention meant I was needy, that showing sadness made me weak. So I became good at hiding, not just from others, from myself. I wore masks, I played roles. I told myself stories that made the pain make sense. This is just how life is. I just need to tough it out. I don't need anyone. But those stories became walls, and the higher they got, the more alone I felt. Eventually, I started to understand that the behaviors I used to judge myself for were actually adaptations. They were how I survived. They were how I made it through emotions that felt too big to hold at the time. And while they may not have been healthy, they were intelligent. They made sense in the context of the pain I didn't yet know how to process. But here's the thing. What once saved me was now quietly destroying me. The same patterns that once protected me from pain were now keeping me from healing it. And that realization broke something open. Not in a tragic way, in a liberating one. Because once I saw that my addiction wasn't about weakness, but about pain, I stopped blaming myself. I started getting curious. I began asking, what hurts so badly that I need to numb it? What am I truly longing for underneath all this noise? That's when the shame started to dissolve. Because when you stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as wounded, everything changes. You begin to understand that your behaviors were never about destruction. They were misguided attempts at connection, at soothing, at being okay, even for a moment. And slowly, compassion takes the place of condemnation. It's not an overnight shift. It's messy. There are days when you still fall into old patterns, when the ache feels unbearable. But with awareness comes choice, and with choice comes power. The kind of power that isn't about control, but about honesty, about presence, about sitting with the pain rather than running from it. And I promise you, that moment when you can sit with your pain and not abandon yourself, that's the beginning of healing. Not because the pain disappears, but because you stop fighting it. You stop fighting yourself. That's when I realized the healing wasn't somewhere out there. It was always inside me, waiting to be remembered. I'll tell you more in the next part about where those wounds really began and how much of what I carried wasn't even mine to begin with. There's a moment I'll never forget. I was maybe 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, quietly watching my parents argue about something I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't loud or violent. It was something worse. Cold. Distant. The kind of silence that makes your chest hurt. I remember thinking, if I just stay still enough, maybe they'll stop. Maybe they'll notice I'm here. But they didn't. And that moment, like so many others, etched itself into my nervous system. Not because of what was said, but because of what was never said, what was never offered. It took me years to understand that trauma isn't always about what happened. It's also about what didn't happen. The love that wasn't felt, the safety that wasn't there, the emotions that weren't welcomed. And for me, that was the soil in which addiction took root. You see, we grow up thinking we're supposed to be resilient, to move on, to get over it. But the child inside us doesn't forget. When a parent is emotionally absent, even if they're physically there, it teaches you something dangerous, that your feelings don't matter, that your needs are a burden, that love is something you earn, not something freely given. That's the kind of childhood that doesn't show up in photographs or report cards. It's invisible to the outside world, but inside, it creates this quiet desperation, a hunger for connection so deep it starts to feel like a flaw. And that's what followed me into adulthood. I didn't know how to feel safe in closeness. I didn't know how to ask for help without shame crawling up my spine. I became the kind of person who smiled a lot, kept busy, looked like I had it together. But inside, I felt like a ghost, floating, unseen, uncertain of what it meant to truly belong. So when I found things that gave me a brief sense of calm or joy, whether it was a glass of wine, scrolling for hours, or being in control of every detail of my life, I clung to them. Not because I was weak, but because I was trying to recreate something I never got as a kid. A sense of being held. Gabor Maté talks about this, how childhood emotional absence can alter the way our brains develop, how it disrupts the systems that regulate stress, impulse, and attachment. And when I read his words, it felt like someone finally explained my entire life, because I wasn't just impulsive or bad at boundaries. I was wired for survival in an environment that didn't make space for my emotions. And the survival mechanisms I developed, they worked. They got me through, but they also kept me locked in a pattern of seeking soothing in things that ultimately left me emptier. It's wild to realize how early some of those patterns started. I remember rocking myself to sleep at night or biting my nails until they bled. Tiny behaviors that felt harmless then, but were actually signals. My body was saying, I need something. I'm not okay. I don't feel safe here. And when you grow up with that as your baseline, you don't even realize it's not normal. You just adapt. You become the good kid, the quiet one, the overachiever, The one who never complains, never needs too much, never makes a fuss, but inside there's this echo chamber of unmet needs, and eventually those needs demand to be heard, one way or another. For some of us, they show up as panic attacks. For others, chronic dissatisfaction, burnout, self-sabotage. And for many, like me, they show up as addiction. Because addiction, in many ways, is a language. The body's way of saying, something hurts and I don't know how else to soothe it. Carl Jung wrote that every form of addiction is a substitute for genuine spiritual connection. That hit me hard, because at the heart of it, I wasn't craving the addiction itself. I was craving something sacred, safety, belonging, meaning, a place in the world that felt like home. And when you don't get that from your earliest relationships, you start looking for it everywhere else. It's heartbreaking, honestly, how many of us carry these silent wounds from childhood. Wounds that society often dismisses because they don't look dramatic enough to count. But trauma isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the soft, persistent message that your needs are inconvenient, that love has to be earned, that your real self is somehow too much. That's the wound I've spent years trying to heal. And here's what I've learned. Healing doesn't mean blaming our parents or wallowing in the past. It means acknowledging the past, honoring the child who didn't get what they needed, and choosing, over and over again, to give that inner child what they were missing. Sometimes that looks like setting boundaries. Sometimes it's letting yourself cry without apologizing. Sometimes it's just sitting still and telling yourself, you're not too much, you're allowed to be here. And over time, those small acts of self-recognition begin to rewire something deep inside. They send a new message to the nervous system. You are safe. You are seen. You matter. I'm still on that path, but every day I take a step, I feel a little closer to something I never thought I could have. A life where I don't need to numb, hide, or perform. A life where I can just be. In the next part, I want to talk about how the world we live in, this fast, loud, addictive culture, makes healing even harder. Because when you're already wounded and the world keeps feeding that emptiness, you start to wonder if wholeness is even possible. But I promise, it is. You know, it's not just our past that shapes our pain. It's the world we live in right now. The way everything around us pushes us to keep going, keep consuming, keep pretending we're fine. And if we're not fine, well, there's an app for that. A product, a quick fix, a dopamine hit. We're constantly being told that the answer is outside of us. That if we just buy the right thing, get the right job, look the right way, post the right content, then maybe finally we'll feel okay. But it's a lie. A beautiful, glossy, addictive lie. I used to think it was just me, that I was uniquely broken, but once I started looking deeper, I saw it everywhere. This low-grade hum of dissatisfaction, this constant need to reach for something, a phone, a drink, a like, a new goal, anything to keep us from sitting in silence with ourselves. Because silence, that's where the truth lives, and most of us are terrified of what we might hear. I remember walking into a coffee shop once and seeing every single person staring at a screen. No eye contact, no stillness, just noise, digital comfort. And I thought, this isn't connection. This is escape. A socially accepted, culturally encouraged form of disconnection. And when you're already carrying unresolved pain, the culture's message is loud and clear. Don't look inward. Just keep scrolling, keep shopping, keep chasing. Because if you stop, even for a moment, you might start to feel something you don't know how to name. That's what makes healing so hard, not just the wounds we carry, but the environment that constantly reinforces them. We live in a world that celebrates busyness, that equates worth with productivity, and that pathologizes rest, reflection, and emotional depth. No wonder so many of us are addicted, not just to substances, but to patterns, roles, identities. anything that keeps us distracted from the ache inside. It's like we're living in a culture that's spiritually starved. And the tragedy is, instead of nourishing ourselves with truth and connection, we binge on emptiness. We consume, perform, distract, and then wonder why we feel even more hollow afterward. I think that's what hit me hardest when I started doing the real work, realizing how much of my pain wasn't mine alone. It was ours, collective, cultural, inherited. It wasn't just my childhood that wounded me. It was the way the world taught me to ignore that wound, to hide it behind achievement and aesthetics. And let me tell you, it's exhausting. But here's the thing, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize that the world profits off your self-doubt, your numbing, your addiction, you start to wake up. And that awakening, it's messy, it's painful, but it's also powerful because now you have a choice. You can keep feeding the machine, keep numbing, performing, hiding, or you can stop, you can pause, you can say, I don't want to live like this anymore. And that moment, that sacred refusal, is the beginning of real freedom. I'm not saying it's easy. The pressure to conform is relentless. The seduction of distraction is strong. But every time you choose presence over performance, every time you breathe instead of scroll, rest instead of grind, reflect instead of react, you reclaim a piece of yourself. And slowly, the noise begins to fade. I started doing small things, turning my phone off an hour before bed, saying no to things I used to say yes to out of guilt, making time to just sit with myself, not to fix anything, but to listen, to ask, what am I actually feeling right now? What do I really need? At first, the answers were uncomfortable. Sometimes the silence felt louder than any addiction ever did. But over time, I started to hear something new, a quieter voice, one that had been buried under all the noise, my own voice. And it wasn't judging me. It wasn't pushing me to do more, be more, earn more. It was just there, whispering, you're allowed to rest, you're allowed to feel, you're allowed to be. That was the beginning of a different kind of healing, not one based on self-improvement, but on self-remembering, on coming home to myself in a world that constantly tells us to leave. And maybe that's the real rebellion in a culture addicted to distraction, to slow down, to feel, to stay, to choose presence, even when it's uncomfortable. Because the truth is, we're not broken, we're just buried. Under expectations, conditioning, and pain we were never meant to carry alone. In the next part, I want to talk about what happens when the addiction really sinks its claws in, how the brain starts working against you, how the self splits into pieces, and how hard it is to find your way out when even your own mind feels like the enemy. But there's hope, I promise. I've lived it. There's this terrifying moment in addiction when you realize you're no longer the one steering the wheel. You can watch yourself making the wrong choice in real time, hear the voice inside you begging you to stop, and you do it anyway. Not because you want to, not because you're bad, but because some deeper mechanism has taken over. And that's the part no one prepares you for. I used to think willpower was everything, that if I just tried harder, was more disciplined, more spiritual, more organized, I could pull myself out of the spiral. But addiction doesn't care about your logic. It doesn't care how much you understand or how sincerely you want to change. Because it's not just psychological, and it's neurological. It lives in the wiring of your brain, in the pathways carved over years of coping. I remember reading about this concept Maté talks about, brain lock. That moment when you're fully aware that your behavior is harming you, but some part of you is already set in motion, unreachable by reason. It was such a relief to have words for that, to know I wasn't insane, that what I was experiencing wasn't some moral failure. It was biology, trauma, survival mode misfiring, There were times I would sit there completely still, tears in my eyes, and still reach for the thing I swore I'd stop using. It felt like I was possessed, not by a demon, but by a version of me who didn't know how to be safe any other way. And that's what broke my heart, because I wasn't just fighting a habit, I was fighting for myself, for the part of me that still believed I was worth saving. Jung wrote about this split, the inner division that happens when parts of ourselves go unacknowledged for too long. The shadow, he called it, the exiled pieces of our psyche that we're too afraid or ashamed to face. And addiction, in many ways, becomes the bridge between who we pretend to be and who we're too terrified to confront. What I began to understand is that my addiction wasn't trying to destroy me. It was trying to protect me, in the only way it knew how. That doesn't make it harmless, but it does change the story. It means that healing isn't about force. It's not about punishing yourself into being better. It's about turning toward the pain and asking, what are you trying to tell me? The truth is, I didn't become addicted because I was selfish or careless or weak. I became addicted because I was in pain, because I was alone with feelings I didn't have the tools to process, because something in me learned that soothing was more accessible than healing. And when the soothing becomes the only thing that numbs the ache, you start to depend on it, not out of desire, but out of fear. I feared what I'd feel without it. I feared the rawness of unfiltered emotions. I feared the quiet of sobriety, the honesty of presence, because what if I couldn't handle what I found there? That fear was real. But what I didn't see then, and what I see now, is that the pain I was avoiding wasn't a monster. It was a message. It was the younger version of me, still waiting to be heard. And no substance, no behavior, no distraction could offer that kind of listening. Only I could, so I started small. When the urge came, instead of reaching, I would breathe. I didn't always win, but I began to pause. And in that pause, I started noticing things. My body clenching, my chest tightening, my thoughts racing. I realized the addiction wasn't the beginning of the spiral. It was the end of it. The beginning was always an emotion, a story, a trigger, a wound. That awareness didn't fix everything, but it gave me a foothold. It reminded me that even if my brain was locked in an old pattern, my presence could interrupt it. Not always perfectly, not without setbacks, but with compassion, because shame only deepened the cycle. Every time I told myself I was failing, I fed the very pain I was trying to numb. But when I said, "This makes sense, you're hurting, I'm here," the grip loosened, even just a little, and those little loosenings became lifelines. I won't lie to you. It's hard. When you've lived with addiction, you get used to being at war with yourself. You doubt your joy. You fear your impulses. You second-guess your healing. But the war begins to end the moment you stop seeing parts of yourself as enemies. That includes the addicted part. What if, instead of shaming it, we sat with it, asked it what it needed, what it was afraid of? That's when things started to shift for me. Not because I conquered my addiction, but because I started building a relationship with the part of me that carried the most pain. And in that relationship, something powerful emerged. Trust. Trust that I could feel without being undone, that I could be with myself in the storm and still stand. That's what I want to explore next. What it looks like to face the shadow without running, to begin integrating the parts we've long disowned, because that's where the real healing lives. Not in perfection, not in control, but in integration, in the radical act of becoming whole again. Here's the thing about shadow work. It's never as dramatic as we imagine. It's not a single moment where everything shifts and you walk away a completely different person. It's a gradual unraveling, a slow, tender unveiling of the parts of yourself you've been hiding, often without realizing it. When I started doing the work of truly facing my addiction, I didn't expect to meet some dramatic, villainous shadow. I thought it would be obvious. I thought it would be a big, dark force, something I could pinpoint and conquer. But what I found was much more subtle, much more human. The parts of me that had been running the show, the parts that had driven me to seek relief in unhealthy ways, weren't monsters. They were wounded parts of me. They were the child who didn't feel safe, the teenager who was told not to feel too much, the adult who was so afraid of rejection that they would push away the very connection they craved. At first, I didn't know how to deal with this. How do you begin to integrate the parts of you that have been buried under layers of shame and fear for years? How do you love the parts of yourself that have made choices you're not proud of? What I've learned, slowly, painfully, and with a lot of trial and error, is that the process of integration isn't about fixing yourself. It's about acceptance. It's about inviting the parts of you that feel broken, lost, or ashamed to come home. You don't fight your shadow. You listen to it. You let it tell you its story. You let it express the pain it's been holding. And then, instead of shaming it or rejecting it, you embrace it. You make space for it. You recognize that it's not the part of you that is flawed. It's simply the part that has been misunderstood, unacknowledged, or unloved for too long. For me, this meant starting with the addiction itself. Instead of seeing it as the enemy, a thing I had to rid myself of at all costs, I started asking, what is it trying to protect me from? What is it trying to say? It wasn't easy to listen. I wanted to push the addiction away, to get rid of it as quickly as possible. But as I sat with it, I realized something important. The addiction wasn't the problem. It was the coping mechanism. The behavior was just a symptom of deeper pain I hadn't known how to address. And so I began to sit with the emotions that had been numbed by my addiction. I started to allow myself to feel the sadness I had been avoiding, the anger I had been suppressing, the fear I had been running from. I began to accept that these feelings, all of them, were part of me. They didn't define me. They didn't control me. But they needed to be heard. I began to understand that addiction wasn't about wanting something badly. It was about needing something: safety, comfort, relief from emotional pain. The addictive behavior itself wasn't inherently bad. It was simply a misguided attempt to solve a problem I didn't know how to name. In this process, I started to reframe my understanding of addiction. I stopped seeing it as a moral failure or something to be ashamed of, and instead, I began to see it as a signal that I had been hurt, that I had needs I wasn't addressing, and that I needed to listen to myself more deeply. Addiction wasn't the enemy, it was a teacher. It had been trying to help me survive in a world where I didn't feel seen or understood. And as I started integrating these painful pieces of myself, I noticed a shift. It wasn't immediate, but it was real. I began to feel more whole, more connected to myself. I started making different choices, not because I was forcing myself to be better, but because I was finally allowing myself to be fully human, messy, complicated, imperfect, and worthy of love as I was. This isn't about perfection. It's about making peace with the parts of you that are hardest to accept. It's about learning to love the parts of you that you've been taught to hide. And it's about realizing that healing doesn't come from perfection. It comes from presence. And let me be clear, this is a process. Some days the shadow feels heavy again. Some days I still want to reach for the things that soothe me temporarily. But the difference now is that I don't run from the shadow. I lean into it. I don't see it as something to destroy or banish. I see it as something to understand, to love, and to integrate. That's where true healing begins, when you stop seeing your flaws as flaws and start seeing them as parts of the beautiful, complicated, messy whole that you are. And that, I believe, is the key to freedom. Not from addiction, not from pain, but from the belief that you are unworthy of your own love. Next, I want to talk about how this process of integration, this work of becoming whole, changes not just how we see ourselves, but how we interact with the world. Because when we start to accept ourselves fully, the world around us begins to shift. It's not just about breaking old habits, it's about creating new patterns, new ways of being that reflect the love, compassion, and understanding we've finally found for ourselves. Once you begin the process of integrating your shadow, something amazing starts to happen. Your relationships with the world around you change. I remember thinking that healing would just fix me, that once I figured it out, I would be okay and everything else would fall into place. But what I've discovered is that when you start healing internally, your external world begins to shift as well. Your relationships with others, your environment, and even your career, all of it begins to reflect the way you've started to reflect on yourself. Here's what I mean by that. When I was lost in my addiction, I wasn't just running from myself. I was also running from my relationships. I couldn't be fully present with anyone because I wasn't fully present with myself. I used to think that if I could just do better, be more productive, keep everyone happy, then I would be enough. But all that striving, all that pushing, just kept me further from real connection. The more I embraced my own wounds, the more I allowed myself to feel, to sit in discomfort, and to accept the brokenness that once terrified me, the more I began to show up fully for the people I loved. And that's the strange magic of healing. As you heal, you can't help but extend that healing to others. It's not that I suddenly had all the answers. It's that I began to be honest with the people around me in a way I never had before. I didn't need to hide behind the perfect image of someone who has it all together. Instead, I allowed myself to be human. And the more I let myself be real, the more others started to feel safe being real with me. This doesn't mean I became a perfect friend, partner, or family member, far from it. But what it does mean is that I could be more present for them. I stopped running from the parts of me that felt unworthy, and in doing so, I stopped running from the parts of them that made me uncomfortable. I didn't need to project my fears onto them anymore. I could just sit with them, with all their flaws, all their pain, all their humanity, and hold space for it, just like I had learned to do for myself. In many ways, this was the true test of healing. It wasn't just about self-acceptance. It was about seeing others with the same compassion I'd learned to extend to myself. I had to let go of the idea that I needed to fix anyone or that they needed to be anything other than who they were, and that was a huge shift. Because for so long I'd believed that love meant changing someone else, molding them into a better version of themselves. But now I understood that love meant acceptance. It meant seeing the other person fully without trying to mold them into someone else. This wasn't an easy process. In fact, it's still ongoing. There are days when I feel triggered, when my old patterns of defensiveness or avoidance rise up. But when those moments happen now, I know how to pause. I know how to sit with the discomfort instead of running from it. And more importantly, I know how to stay present, both with myself and with the people I care about. This is the gift of integration. When you heal the relationship you have with yourself, you naturally heal your relationships with others. When you stop fighting your own shadow, you stop fighting the shadows of others. You begin to see the humanity in everyone, not as an obstacle, but as a shared experience. You begin to realize that we are all just trying to make sense of this messy, beautiful world. We are all just trying to find a way back to ourselves. And here's the truth I've come to realize. The more I've been able to sit with my own pain, the more I've been able to sit with the pain of others. The more I've understood my own struggles with addiction, the more I can truly listen to someone else's story without judgment. The more I've made peace with my own mistakes, the more I can extend grace to others when they stumble. The shift is profound, and it's subtle. It doesn't happen overnight. But when it does happen, it's as if a veil has been lifted. You begin to see people and yourself in a new light. You begin to realize that all of our suffering, all of our struggles, are part of what makes us human. And that's the beauty of it all. As I continue to walk this path of healing, I realize more and more that it's not about reaching some final destination. It's about the journey, the constant return to wholeness, the continuous learning to love ourselves exactly as we are. The more I embrace my own imperfections, the more I can hold space for the imperfections of others. I think that's where real freedom lies, not in becoming perfect, but in allowing yourself to be imperfect, in allowing others to be imperfect, in realizing that none of us are truly broken. We're just in the process of remembering who we really are. And once you begin to remember that, the whole world starts to change. Now, as I reflect on my journey, I realize that true healing isn't about fixing what's wrong. It's about embracing what is and learning to live in alignment with it. It's about accepting yourself fully without judgment or shame. And when you do that, you create a space where others can do the same. In the next part, I want to share a bit about how this journey has taught me to approach life with more trust and less control. Because I've realized that trying to control everything, including my healing, only ever keeps me stuck. True freedom comes when we allow ourselves to flow, to let go, and to trust that even in our mess, we are exactly where we're supposed to be. There's something liberating about realizing that you can't control everything and that you don't need to. For the longest time, I tried to manage every aspect of my life. I thought that if I just stayed on top of everything, if I was disciplined enough, organized enough, planned enough, I could somehow protect myself from pain. I could control the chaos. I could avoid the feelings that seemed too big, too overwhelming to handle. But here's the thing. When you spend all your energy trying to control everything, you miss out on the most important thing, life itself. Life doesn't unfold according to a plan. It doesn't follow the neat outlines we try to create for it. And the more I tried to control it, the more I realized I was actually resisting it. I'll be honest, letting go of control was one of the hardest things I've ever done. For a long time, I believed that control was the only thing keeping me together. It was the way I managed the chaos inside, the way I protected myself from the overwhelming feelings I didn't know how to process. If I could just control everything around me, then maybe, just maybe, I could avoid feeling the things I was so afraid to feel. But what I learned, slowly, painfully, is that control doesn't bring peace. It only creates more anxiety. Because when you're constantly trying to control everything, you're never really present. You're always planning ahead, anticipating what could go wrong, running through a mental checklist. And in doing that, you miss the beauty of what's happening right now. True freedom, I've come to understand, doesn't come from control. It comes from surrender. It comes from allowing life to unfold as it will, trusting that whatever happens, you'll be okay. And this isn't a passive, whatever happens, happens kind of surrender. It's an active choice, a choice to stop fighting against the natural flow of life and instead meet it with openness and curiosity. This shift wasn't easy. I had to face the fear that had been driving my need for control, the fear that if I stopped managing everything, I would fall apart. I had to confront the belief that I wasn't strong enough to handle life without having a tight grip on it. But the more I let go, the more I realized that life doesn't require control. It requires trust. Trust that I am strong enough to handle whatever comes my way. Trust that no matter what happens, I will be okay. This shift in perspective started to change everything. I stopped trying to be perfect. I stopped trying to make everything look good on the outside. I started embracing my imperfections, my mess, my chaos. And the funny thing is, the more I allowed myself to be imperfect, the more at peace I became. The more I let go of the need to control, the more I found myself present in the moment. I started to experience life fully, without fear of the things I couldn't predict. And you know what? Life became richer, deeper, more fulfilling. I began to see the beauty in the mess. I saw the lessons in the struggles. I began to trust the process of life instead of trying to manage it. I learned to ride the waves instead of trying to control the ocean. This has been the most transformative part of my healing journey. Letting go of the need for control has opened me up to a life that is far more joyful, far more alive than I ever imagined possible. And it's not because everything has fallen into place the way I thought it would. It's because I've learned to let go of my expectations, to embrace life as it comes, and to trust that I am capable of handling whatever comes my way. This doesn't mean I don't have moments of doubt or fear. It doesn't mean I've figured it all out. But it does mean that I am no longer afraid of life. I am no longer afraid of feeling what I feel or facing what I fear. I am no longer afraid of surrendering control. And the most incredible part? I've discovered a peace that I never thought was possible. A peace that comes from accepting the uncertainty, the mess, and the unpredictability of life. A peace that comes from trusting that, even when I can't control everything, I can always trust myself to be okay. In the final part of this journey, I want to talk about the true freedom that comes from acceptance. The freedom that arises when you stop fighting yourself, when you stop trying to be someone you're not, and when you finally embrace all the parts of you that you've been running from. Because when you truly accept yourself, when you truly see your worth and your humanity, you are free. Free from the need to be perfect. Free from the need to be anyone else. And in that freedom, you find a peace that can't be shaken, and that I believe is the key to living fully, to living without fear, without shame, and without the need to control everything around you. It's the peace of knowing that you are enough, exactly as you are. As I reflect on everything I've learned, I realize that the journey wasn't just about overcoming addiction or healing old wounds. It was about something deeper. It was about learning to accept myself. The parts of me I thought were unlovable, the parts I tried to hide, and the parts that felt broken. Acceptance has been the most transformative element of my healing. Not just accepting the things that are easy to love, but accepting the parts of myself that have been messy, imperfect, and even painful. In my earlier years, I thought healing meant fixing everything. I thought it meant eliminating the things I didn't like about myself. But now I see that healing isn't about perfection. It's about wholeness. It's about embracing every part of you, the light and the shadow, and recognizing that you are enough just as you are. I've realized that true freedom comes from this kind of self-acceptance. Freedom is not about changing yourself into something else. It's about embracing who you truly are, without judgment, without the need to constantly prove yourself. For so much of my life, I was trying to be someone I thought I was supposed to be, someone who fit in, someone who had it all together, someone who never made mistakes. But now I see that the person I am is more than enough. I don't need to hide any longer. I don't need to pretend. In this process of acceptance, I've also discovered something profound about the relationships I have with others. When you start to accept yourself, all of yourself, you begin to see others with a new kind of compassion. You stop expecting them to be perfect. You stop needing them to fix you or to meet all of your needs. And you begin to realize that the beauty of a relationship lies in the imperfections, the messiness, the vulnerability, the realness of it all. I've learned that healing isn't about walking away from the past. It's about integrating it. It's about looking at the pain, the mistakes, the struggles, and saying, These are a part of me, these have shaped me, but they don't define me. Healing is about making peace with the parts of yourself that you've hidden for so long and allowing them to become a source of strength rather than shame. I don't believe in the idea of a finished healing. I don't think we ever arrive at some perfect state where everything is healed and we're free from pain. But I do believe in the power of self-acceptance, the power to look at yourself, flaws and all, and say, I am enough. That, to me, is the heart of freedom. And what I've found in that freedom is the ability to be fully present in my life, to show up without fear of judgment, without the need to be perfect, and without the need to escape into old habits. I can sit with the discomfort, sit with the pain, sit with the uncertainty, and trust that I am capable of handling it. Because now I trust myself. True freedom is not in running from the parts of yourself you don't like. It's in accepting them. It's in recognizing that every part of you, every part of your past, every mistake, every fear, is what makes you uniquely who you are. And when you embrace that, when you stop fighting against yourself, you start living in a way that feels real, authentic, and true. As I wrap up this journey, I realize that everything I've been searching for, peace, happiness, connection, was always here, within me. The key was never outside. It was always about accepting who I am, exactly as I am. And in that acceptance, I found the peace I had been seeking for so long. So I want to leave you with this. You are enough, exactly as you are. You don't need to fix yourself. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to show up. You need to be honest with yourself, accept yourself, and trust that the journey you're on, with all its twists, turns, and bumps, is exactly where you're meant to be. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of peace. And most importantly, you are worthy of your own acceptance. That, to me, is the ultimate freedom. The freedom to be yourself, to embrace your humanity and to live fully, without shame, without fear, and without the need to control everything around you.